She didn't lower her voice. She raised it. That was the first thing I understood as I stood by the front door, my hand resting on the back of a chair I hadn't chosen, listening to my daughter-in-law tell me who I was in a tone meant to travel. "You're a worthless dad," she said, slow and clear like she wanted the words to stick. "You don't contribute anything anymore. You just take up space." The living room went very still. Not the quiet of shock, the quiet of an audience settling in. The curtains were open. I saw that immediately. She had opened them earlier on purpose. Outside, neighbors had stopped on the sidewalk, a woman walking her dog, a couple pretending to check their phone, a man leaning against his car. 15 sets of eyes, give or take, all pointed in the same direction, toward me. My son stood a few steps behind her. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct her. He didn't look at me. His silence was louder than her shouting. "You've had enough time," she went on. "This house isn't a retirement plan. We need our space, our future." She said "our" like I wasn't part of the sentence at all. I opened my mouth once, closed it again. Not because I had nothing to say, because I suddenly understood something much colder than anger. This wasn't a fight. This was a decision they'd already made. She disappeared down the hallway and came back with a single suitcase. Mine. Light enough to lift with one hand, she set it at my feet and stepped back satisfied. I picked it up without a word. As I walked out, I felt every eye on me. Pity from some, curiosity from others, shame maybe from one or two. I kept my head up anyway. They thought this was the end of me. They had no idea what they'd just given me permission to do. The front door closed behind me with a soft, ordinary sound. No slam. No drama. Just the quiet click of a life rearranging itself. The air outside felt sharper than I expected, like my skin had been wrapped too long in cotton and was only now remembering how to feel. I stood on the porch for half a second, adjusting the grip on the suitcase handle, then stepped down into the afternoon light. No one spoke to me. Not at first. People are like that when something indecent has happened in public. They don't want to be seen acknowledging it. I didn't blame them. I didn't need witnesses anymore. As I walked, I heard my daughter-in-law's voice carry one last time through the open window. Something about finally having peace. Something about moving on. I kept going. The street stretched ahead of me, familiar and suddenly foreign, like a photograph from a life I no longer lived. I'd walked this block countless times, with groceries, with my wife years ago pointing out which houses we liked and which ones we didn't. With my son when he was younger, his hand wrapped around my finger, his questions endless. Now I walked it alone, pulling a suitcase that held everything they'd decided I was allowed to keep. I didn't look inside it yet. I didn't need to. I already knew what it contained. A few clothes, some toiletries, a pair of old shoes I hadn't worn in years. Nothing sentimental, nothing valuable, nothing that suggested I had ever built anything anywhere with anyone. They had been thorough. My phone vibrated in my pocket as I reached the end of the block. I didn't check it. I knew who it would be, or at least who it wouldn't. Silence had a clarity to it I wasn't ready to break. At the corner, I stopped and took a breath. The kind that comes from deep in the chest, slow and deliberate. The kind my wife used to take when she was bracing herself before saying something difficult. "Keep your dignity," she used to say, "even when it costs you, especially then." I adjusted the suitcase handle again and kept walking. I didn't know where I was going yet. That was the truth. But I knew where I wasn't going. I wasn't going back into that house to argue. I wasn't going to plead my case to a woman who had already decided my value for me. I wasn't going to raise my voice so she could say later that I'd proven her right. I had learned something over the years, building a life piece by piece. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. A man pulled over near the curb a few houses down, rolling his window halfway down. He hesitated, then spoke. "Elias," he said. "You okay?" I recognized him. A neighbor, not a close one. Someone who waved, who borrowed tools once or twice, who knew my name. "I'm fine," I said. The word came out steady. Not true, but steady. He nodded, uncertain, then drove off. Fine. That's what people say when there's no space for the real answer. By the time I reached the bus stop, the adrenaline had drained out of me, leaving something heavier behind. Not rage, not despair. Awareness. They hadn't thrown me out in a moment of anger. They had staged it. The timing. The audience. The language. Worthless. Burden. Space. Those weren't emotional words. They were strategic ones. I sat down on the bench and set the suitcase beside me. For the first time, I let myself feel the humiliation. It washed through me slowly, not like a wave, but like a tide, persistent and cold. Being dismissed is one thing. Being erased is another. I thought of the years I had lived under that roof after my wife passed away. How carefully I'd tried not to be in the way. How often I'd offered help and been told it was handled. How many decisions had been made around me, not with me. I had mistaken politeness for respect. My phone vibrated again and again. I didn't answer. The bus came and went. I didn't get on. I wasn't ready to be carried anywhere yet. Eventually, I stood and started walking again, this time with no particular direction in mind. I found myself near a small hotel I'd passed 100 times without noticing. Nothing fancy. Clean windows, a quiet lobby. The kind of place people use when they don't want to be asked questions. That felt right. Inside, the clerk barely looked up as I checked in. I paid, took the key, rode the elevator up alone. The room was exactly what it needed to be. A bed, a chair, a desk. A bathroom with towels folded into precise, impersonal shapes. No family photos on the walls, no expectations. I set the suitcase down by the bed and sat for a moment without opening it. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I thought about the look on my daughter-in-law's face as she handed me that suitcase. The certainty, the relief, the way she believed she had closed a chapter. I thought about my son's silence, how it had settled everything more effectively than shouting ever could. And I thought about something else too. Something they hadn't asked about, something they hadn't checked for, not yet. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of other lives moving behind thin walls. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed. Somewhere else, a television murmured. The world had not ended. It had narrowed, sharpened, clarified. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. I closed my eyes and let a single thought settle in, solid and undeniable. They believed they had taken everything from me. What they didn't understand was this. The most dangerous things I owned had never been in that house at all. I woke up before the alarm, the room still dark and quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears when you're not used to sleeping alone. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was. Then the unfamiliar ceiling came into focus, and with it the weight of the day before settled back into my chest. I lay there without moving, listening to the low hum of the building. Pipes. An elevator somewhere. A door closing softly down the hall. Life continuing, indifferent and steady. No one here knew me. No one here had watched me be escorted out of a house I'd thought was still mine. That thought stung, but it didn't knock the air out of me the way I expected. The humiliation was still there, yes, like a bruise you discover the morning after a fall. Tender, undeniable. But beneath it was something else, quieter and sharper. Clarity. When I finally sat up, I did it slowly, deliberately. I wasn't rushing toward anything, and I wasn't running away either. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and placed my feet on the carpet, grounding myself in the ordinary physicality of the moment. This was my first morning truly alone since my wife died. I hadn't realized how much company I'd had even in my loneliness before. There had always been someone in the house. A voice from another room. The sound of a television I wasn't watching. The illusion of belonging, even when the substance had long since faded. Now there was none of that. Just me, a suitcase, and a door that locked from the inside. I stood stretched and went into the bathroom. The mirror greeted me without comment. An older man looked back, lines deeper than they used to be, eyes more tired but clearer than I'd seen them in a long time. "You're still here," I said softly, testing the sound of my voice in the empty room. I splashed water on my face and let it drip down my chin. The cold woke me fully. Good. I didn't want to drift through this day half awake. On the desk by the window, my phone lay face down where I'd placed it the night before. I picked it up and turned it over. Missed calls, messages, more than I'd expected. My son, my daughter-in-law. One message from a number I didn't recognize, probably someone who'd heard a version of the story already and wanted to insert themselves into it. I didn't open any of them. Not yet. Silence. I was beginning to understand made people uneasy. They expected reactions, anger, tears, demands, apologies. Silence gave them nothing to work with, and that unsettled them far more than shouting ever could. I set the phone back down and went to the window. Outside, the city was waking up. Cars moving in steady lines. Someone jogging past with headphones in. A woman unlocking the door to a coffee shop, her movements practiced and unhurried. No one out there knew I'd been declared worthless less than 12 hours ago. The thought almost made me smile. I dressed slowly, choosing comfort over appearance. There was no one to impress today. When I finished, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the suitcase. I hadn't opened it yet. I'd avoided it the night before, not out of fear, but because I didn't want to confirm how little of my life they deemed worthy of carrying forward. Now felt like the right time. I knelt and unzipped it carefully. Inside, everything was arranged with efficient indifference. Clothes folded tight, socks paired, a small toiletry bag. No photographs, no books. None of the objects that had once anchored me to the past. They had curated my exit. I touched each item briefly, not lingering, just acknowledging. This too was information. They had already decided who I was and what I needed. Or rather, what I didn't. At the bottom of the suitcase, beneath a sweater I'd almost forgotten I owned, was the one thing I had insisted on packing myself. I didn't take it out. I just placed my hand over it for a moment, feeling its reassuring solidity. Everything that mattered had always been small enough to carry. I closed the suitcase and stood suddenly aware of how steady my hands were. That surprised me more than anything else. I'd expected shaking, a collapse, some visible sign that I'd been wounded. Instead, I felt alert, awake, as if a fog I hadn't known was there had finally lifted. I thought about the night before, about the way my daughter-in-law had spoken with such certainty. The way she'd said our future and meant a future without me in it. The confidence with which she'd placed that suitcase at my feet already convinced she had won something. People only behave like that when they think the story is over. I sat back down on the bed and picked up my phone again. This time, I opened one message. Just one. It was from my son. "Dad, please call me. We need to talk. Nothing else. No apology, no explanation. Just an assumption that the next move was mine." I locked the screen and set the phone aside. For years I had been responding, adjusting, making myself smaller so others could feel larger. I'd thought it was kindness, maturity, letting go. What it had really been was accommodation. And accommodation, when taken too far, becomes erasure. I stood and paced the room slowly, letting my thoughts settle into order. I wasn't planning revenge. That word carried too much heat, too much recklessness. I wasn't even planning confrontation. That would only give them what they wanted. Noise, emotion, something to point at and label. What I was planning was distance. Distance gave you perspective. Distance gave you leverage. Distance gave you time to see patterns you'd been too close to notice. I stopped pacing and sat again this time at the small desk. I rested my forearms on the surface and leaned forward, breathing evenly. My wife used to say that silence could be many things: punishment, protection, or preparation. Last night it had been protection. This morning it felt like preparation. I thought of her then not with the ache that usually accompanied the memory, but with something steadier. I remembered the way she'd pause before responding when someone crossed a line. Her expression thoughtful, her eyes sharp. Don't rush to fill the quiet, she used to tell me. Let people show you who they are when there's nothing to distract them. I wondered what she would have thought of yesterday, of the spectacle, of the words thrown so casually, so cruelly. I suspected she wouldn't have been surprised. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me attentive. I checked the time. Still early. I had nowhere to be and no one to answer to. That too was new. I left the room and went down to the lobby, stepping out into the morning air a few minutes later. The city smelled like coffee and pavement warming in the sun. Ordinary comforting things. I walked without direction, letting my feet choose the path. Each step put a little more distance between me and the house where I'd been told I no longer belonged. As I walked, my phone vibrated again. I ignored it. Then again, I didn't check. Somewhere behind those messages, I could already sense a shift. Confusion giving way to concern. Concern edging toward unease. Silence had a way of accelerating that process. By the time I found myself sitting on a park bench, watching pigeons argue over crumbs, I understood something with absolute clarity. They believed my silence meant I was processing my loss. What it actually meant was that I was taking inventory. I wasn't asking what I'd lost. I was asking what I still controlled. The answer to that question hadn't changed, no matter what names they called me, or how loudly they said them. I sat there longer than I needed to, letting the realization settle fully into my bones. The sun climbed higher. The city moved around me. Life, it seemed, was patient. Eventually, I stood and brushed off my hands, my decision complete even if its details were not. I would not rush. I would not react. I would not announce anything. They thought the story had ended with me walking out that front door. They were wrong. It had only just shifted out of their line of sight. I didn't plan to think about the beginning that night. It arrived on its own, quiet and persistent, the way certain memories do, when you finally stop outrunning them. I was back in the hotel room, sitting at the small desk by the window. The city outside had dimmed to a scattering of lights, each one a separate life continuing without any awareness of mine. I reached into the suitcase, not looking for anything in particular, and my fingers brushed against something firm and familiar. An old leather notebook, worn at the edges, thinner than it used to be. I hadn't opened it in years. As soon as I touched it, the room faded slightly, as if my mind had decided where we were going next without consulting me. I leaned back in the chair, the notebook resting in my hands, and let myself drift. Before there was a company, before there was money, before there was a house anyone could throw me out of, there was just me and my wife at a kitchen table that wobbled if you leaned on it too hard. We were younger then, tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. The kind of tired that came from working all day and then staying up late to talk about what came next because not talking felt worse. I had an idea. Not a brilliant one, not a guaranteed one, just an idea that refused to leave me alone. Something about how technology could solve a problem most people didn't even realize they had yet. I talked about it endlessly. Too endlessly, probably. I went over the same points again and again, changing details, second-guessing myself, finding flaws before anyone else could point them out. My wife listened. Not politely, not indulgently, really listened. One night, after I'd finished explaining for what felt like the 100th time why it might not work, she reached across the table and took my hand. Then we'll find out, she said. That was it. No promises, no illusions. Just a quiet decision that we would try. Those early years were not romantic. They were cramped and uncertain and relentless. I worked during the day and built at night. She managed the household, balanced bills down to the last dollar, and found ways to stretch what little we had without ever making it feel like sacrifice. There were months when the numbers didn't add up, when I stared at spreadsheets and wondered if I was dragging us both towards something foolish. More than once, I considered walking away, telling myself it was the responsible thing to do. Every time she stopped me, not with encouragement, but with questions. What changed, she would ask. Did the idea stop making sense? Or did you just get scared? She knew me too well to let me hide behind logic. The first client came later than I'd hoped, smaller than I'd imagined. I remember sitting in the car afterward, hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, while my heart raced like I'd just escaped something dangerous. We didn't celebrate. We couldn't afford to. We reinvested everything. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, momentum built. One contract led to another. One late night became routine instead of emergency. The notebook in my hands filled with diagrams, lists, half-formed plans. Each page felt like a small vote of confidence from the universe. Our son grew up around all of this. He knew the office before he knew school hallways. He learned to fall asleep to the sound of keyboards and low conversations. He thought it was normal for adults to work until midnight and then get up again before dawn. I wanted him to understand effort, to respect process. What I didn't see then was how much of the struggle he missed simply by being young. He saw the results more than the risk, the rewards more than the uncertainty. When the company began to stabilize, when the fear of losing everything faded, he absorbed that version of the story instead. Success has a way of editing memory. As the years passed, money became less of a topic, not because there was so much of it, but because it no longer needed explaining. Bills were paid, vacations happened. Comfort settled in quietly. Gratitude, I learned, is fragile when comfort becomes expected. My wife noticed before I did. She always did. I remember a night when we were sitting together after dinner, the house unusually quiet. Our son was older by then, busy with his own life, his own plans. She looked thoughtful, distant in a way that caught my attention. "They're starting to talk around you," she said. I laughed it off at first, told her she was imagining things, that people just got used to systems working. She shook her head. "That's not what I mean." She didn't push. She never did. She planted the thought and trusted it to grow if it needed to. I wish I had taken it more seriously. As the company expanded, my role changed. I stepped back from daily operations, not because I couldn't keep up, but because I believed in succession. I believed in giving space for others to step into responsibility. I told myself that stepping aside was generosity, that trust would be met with respect. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it isn't. The first time I noticed being left out of a conversation, I dismissed it. The second time, I rationalized it. By the third, it had become a pattern I was too invested to name. It was easier to believe everything was fine. Then my wife got sick. The timeline blurred after that. Hospitals, doctors, long waits broken by shorter conversations that carried too much weight. The company continued because it had to. I continued because I didn't know how not to. She remained sharp until the end, observant, quietly assessing even as her body weakened. One afternoon, when she was resting, she asked me to promise her something. "Pay attention," she said. "Not to the numbers, to the people." I told her I would. I meant it. She died believing I would. The notebook grew heavier in my hands as I came back to the present, the hotel room snapping back into focus. I stared at the worn leather cover, at the creases made by years of use, and felt a deep, steady ache settle in my chest. Everything they had, the house, the comfort, the certainty they had inherited, the results, without ever understanding the cost. They had mistaken proximity for entitlement. I closed the notebook and set it gently on the desk. The memories didn't fade immediately. They lingered, reshaping the humiliation of the day before into something else entirely. Perspective. I hadn't been discarded because I was useless. I had been sidelined because I was inconvenient. Because my presence reminded them that nothing they enjoyed had appeared on its own. That truth steadied me more than anger ever could. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights again. Somewhere, people were making decisions that would ripple through their lives in ways they didn't yet understand. I had been one of those people once. I was still one of them. If they believed I was finished, it was only because they had never really seen how this all began. Morning came with a kind of brittle clarity. The memories from the night before hadn't faded the way dreams usually do. They sat neatly in place, aligned now with things I had felt for months, but never named. What happened at the door hadn't been a sudden explosion. It had been the last tile clicking into place. I dressed and left the hotel early, walking without hurry, letting the city wake up around me. With each step, small moments from the recent past surfaced uninvited, lining up as if they'd been waiting for permission. There was the meeting I'd been accidentally left out of. I remembered that clearly now. I'd found out about it afterward when a decision had already been made and explained to me as a courtesy. At the time, I'd smiled and nodded, telling myself it was progress, that the company no longer needed me hovering. There was the document I'd been handed to sign, summarized verbally instead of shown in full. I'd trusted the explanation, trusted the tone, trusted the people standing in front of me because trusting them felt easier than questioning why I wasn't being included anymore. There were conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Not abruptly, just subtly enough to be deniable. I'd noticed all of it. I just hadn't connected it. As I walked, I replayed the way my daughter-in-law spoke in the house. Not just the words she used, but how she used them. The confidence. The way she framed everything as a conclusion rather than a discussion. You've had enough time. We need our space. This house isn't a retirement plan. That language hadn't been emotional. It had been procedural. At a cafe, I ordered coffee and sat near the window watching people come and go. I didn't drink right away. I let the cup warm my hands while I thought. The power dynamic in that house hadn't shifted overnight. It had been inching away from me quietly, persistently, long before I was told to leave. I remembered the first time she said, "We already decided," instead of, "What do you think?" It had been about something trivial. A renovation detail, a scheduling change. I'd shrugged it off, telling myself I didn't need to weigh in on everything. That had been the beginning. From there, the decisions grew larger. Financial arrangements, travel plans, business discussions that used to include me as a matter of course. Each exclusion was small enough to justify on its own. Together, they formed something unmistakable. Control. I took a sip of the coffee, the bitterness grounding me. Across the room, a couple sat close together, heads bent, sharing a conversation that felt private, even from a distance. I wondered when my own household had stopped feeling like that. When discussion had turned into management. The business, too, had started to feel different. Not hostile, just distant. I'd been told more than once that things were running smoothly and I should enjoy my rest. That my experience was valued, but my involvement wasn't necessary anymore. It had been presented as kindness, as consideration for my age. At the time, I'd accepted that framing. Now I recognized it for what it was. A soft boundary being drawn around me. I finished my coffee and left the cafe, the realization settling with a weight that was heavy, but clarifying. I wasn't dealing with misunderstanding or impatience. I was dealing with a plan. Back in the hotel room, I sat at the desk and forced myself to go through recent events slowly, one by one, without emotion. Emotion would come later. Right now, I needed accuracy. There had been a conversation about my stress levels, casual, lightly concerned, a suggestion that I take a step back from anything complicated. I remembered laughing it off, making a joke about being tougher than I looked. There had been a suggestion that I let someone else handle my mail so nothing important slipped through the cracks. There had been a day when a doctor's appointment I didn't remember scheduling appeared on my calendar already confirmed. At the time, none of it had seemed threatening. Concern, after all, wears many disguises. Now the pattern was impossible to ignore. My phone buzzed again on the desk. I glanced at it without picking it up. Another message. Another attempt to pull me back into conversation on terms that weren't mine. I didn't respond. I thought of my wife then, of the way she used to tilt her head slightly when something didn't sit right with her. She never accused. She observed. She trusted patterns more than excuses. She had seen this coming. Not in detail, perhaps, but in direction. And I had chosen comfort over vigilance. That choice had cost me my voice. I stood and paced the room slowly, hands clasped behind my back. The anger was there now, but it was contained, pressed into something tighter and more useful. They hadn't just wanted me out of the house. That much was clear. They had wanted me out of relevance, out of authority, out of the way, and they had been laying the groundwork carefully. I stopped pacing and sat again, opening the notebook from the night before, not to read it, but to remind myself of something important. I had built a complex system from nothing once. I understood how plans unfolded, how people moved when they thought they were being watched and when they thought they weren't. This was no different. The hardest part wasn't accepting what they were doing. It was accepting how long it had been happening. I let that sink in fully without flinching. There was no benefit in pretending I'd been blindsided. Awareness didn't weaken me. It strengthened me. By midday, the city outside had grown louder. I hadn't eaten. I wasn't hungry. I thought again about the moment at the door. The certainty in my daughter-in-law's eyes. The way she'd already moved on emotionally, already living in a future where I was a solved problem. That certainty depended on one thing. Time. They believed time was on their side, that I would fade quietly, that my silence would become compliance, that my age would do the work for them. They were wrong about one thing. I hadn't been preparing to disappear. I had been preparing to notice. I sat back in the chair and closed my eyes, not to rest, but to focus. The question wasn't whether they had crossed a line. They had. The question was how far they were willing to go, now that the process had begun. And more importantly, how quickly. When I opened my eyes, the answer was already forming. I didn't need proof yet. I didn't need confrontation. What I needed was confirmation. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contact, stopping at a name I hadn't called in a while. Someone who had been around long enough to remember when the company was nothing more than a set of ideas and a stubborn refusal to quit. I didn't call yet. I set the phone back down. Timing mattered. For now, it was enough to acknowledge the truth privately. They hadn't pushed me out in a moment of frustration. They had been escorting me toward the exit for months. And now that I could see the door they'd been guiding me toward, I understood something else with chilling clarity. If this was the plan they'd been patient enough to execute quietly, then patience was no longer a virtue. It was a liability. I looked at the closed door of the hotel room, at the simple lock, at the space that was finally mine again. If they had been planning my exit for months, the question was no longer why. It was how far they were willing to go to make sure I never found my way back. The night stretched long and quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against you until you either break it or listen to what it's trying to say. I sat at the small table by the window, the city lights blurred by a thin layer of glass and distance, and felt the weight of the day finally catch up to me. I wasn't tired in the way sleep fixes. I was tired in the way that comes from seeing too much at once. The suitcase sat open on the bed behind me. I hadn't meant to open it again, but my hands had moved without asking. They always did when something important was waiting. The envelope was still there, tucked into the inner pocket I'd sewn myself years ago. The paper had softened with time, the edges rounded from being carried and not used. My wife's handwriting was visible through the thin layer, familiar enough to make my chest tighten. I had promised myself I wouldn't open it unless I had to. For years I told myself I didn't have to. I turned the envelope over once, then again, as if the act of delaying might somehow change what was inside. The truth was simpler and harder. I'd been afraid of confirmation, afraid that opening it would take away the last excuse I had left. If I didn't know, I could still pretend things might sort themselves out. I pressed my thumb along the crease and thought of her voice, calm and direct the way it always was when she wanted me to listen. She had never raised it to be heard. She had trusted that I would. I broke the seal. The paper slid out easily, folded once. I unfolded it slowly, almost reverently, and began to read. My love. If you're reading this, it means you finally stopped protecting everyone else long enough to protect yourself. I felt that sentence land before I fully understood it. My eyes stayed on the page, but my breath caught anyway. She didn't accuse. She never did. She named patterns. She named tendencies. She wrote the way she spoke with clarity that didn't need volume. She wrote about watching dynamics shift, about influence that grew quietly, about concern that felt rehearsed. She wrote about how easy it was for kindness to become a cover when someone wanted control without confrontation. I read slowly, forcing myself not to skim, not to jump ahead. Every line deserved the respect of attention. I have no proof, she wrote, only instinct. And I know how much you trust instinct when it's your own and how quickly you dismiss it when it's mine. That line hurt more than the rest because it was true. She wrote about my son gently, about how love sometimes made him passive, how avoidance could look like peace when it was really surrender. She didn't call him weak. She didn't call him cruel. She called him persuadable. She wrote about my daughter-in-law carefully, without malice, about ambition that didn't announce itself, about confidence that grew when no one pushed back, about how power preferred quiet rooms and open curtains. I stopped reading for a moment and stared at the wall across from me. My reflection in the darkened window looked older than it had that morning. Not because I'd aged overnight, but because something had been stripped away. Denial, I realized, had been cushioning me. I went back to the letter. There was one paragraph she had underlined lightly, the way she used to underline things she wanted me to remember, not argue with. If the day ever comes when you feel smaller in your own life, then you should please understand, this stepping away is not failure. Holding on to your dignity is not abandonment, and silence, when chosen, can be strength. My throat tightened. I let the paper rest in my hands and closed my eyes, seeing her exactly as she had been in moments like this. Composed, certain, not dramatic, just clear. She hadn't written the letter to warn me of a single event. She had written it to prepare me for a direction. I read the rest more quickly, the words settling into place with a terrible, elegant logic. She never told me what to do. She never asked me to punish anyone. She never used the word betrayal. She trusted me to reach my own conclusions. When I reached the end, I folded the letter back along its original crease and held it against my chest for a long moment, breathing in slowly, deliberately. I wasn't surprised. That realization stunned me more than anything else. Somewhere inside, I had already known. I had felt the erosion of voice, the gradual narrowing of space. I had felt myself becoming an afterthought in rooms I had built. The letter didn't introduce a new reality. It named the one I had been avoiding. I stood and walked to the window, the folded paper still in my hand. Below, cars moved through intersections, headlights sweeping across pavement like brief acknowledgments before disappearing again. My phone buzzed on the table behind me. I didn't turn around. The anger I'd expected didn't come. Neither did despair. What came instead was something steadier, heavier, and far more useful. Permission. I was no longer worried about being unfair. I was no longer afraid of overreacting. My wife had seen enough to leave me this final gift, the certainty that protecting myself was not cruelty. It was responsibility. I went back to the table and placed the letter carefully back into the envelope. I didn't reread it. I didn't need to. Its message had already done its work. I slid it into the suitcase and zipped it closed, then sat down and rested my hands flat on the table. Everything changed in that moment, though nothing outwardly shifted at all. I wasn't going to confront anyone. Confrontation would only invite arguments about tone, intention, memory. It would give them something to deflect with. I wasn't going to explain myself. Explanations assume someone is listening in good faith. What I was going to do was observe, verify, and act. Quietly. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the missed messages without opening them. The language was changing already. Less authority, more concern, a subtle edge of uncertainty creeping in. Silence was doing exactly what my wife had said it would. I thought again of the moment at the door, of the word worthless thrown so casually, so confidently. I understood now why it had felt rehearsed. They needed that story to be true. They needed me to believe it. Belief, I realized, was the real currency they were after. I set the phone down and leaned back in the chair, feeling something inside me settle into place. Grief was still there, but it had changed shape. It no longer hollowed me out. It anchored me. My wife had not warned me so I could be afraid. She had warned me so I could be ready. Outside, the city lights flickered as clouds moved across the sky, shifting patterns without ever asking permission. I watched them for a while, letting the quiet deepen rather than rushing to fill it. When I finally stood, it was with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. And whatever came next would not be loud or dramatic or cruel. It would be precise. In the silence that followed, I understood something with absolute clarity. The man who had walked out of that house with a suitcase had been hurt and disoriented. The man standing here now was awake. And once you are awake, it is very hard for anyone to put you back to sleep. The call came the next morning earlier than I expected, and for a moment I considered letting it ring. Not out of avoidance, but because I sensed that answering it would change the shape of the day in a way I couldn't undo. I answered anyway. "Elias," the voice said, careful and low. I was hoping you'd pick up. I recognized it immediately. Martin Hale. He had been my accountant for nearly 2 decades, long enough to remember when the company's books fit inside a single folder and optimism counted as an asset. Martin wasn't a man who called without reason, and he never sounded like this. "What's wrong?" I asked. There was a pause on the line, long enough to tell me he was choosing his words with unusual care. "I think we should talk in person," he said. "Not at the office." That was all he needed to say. We agreed on a quiet cafe across town, the kind of place people used when they wanted to be surrounded by strangers who weren't listening. I arrived early and took a seat near the back, facing the door. Martin came in a few minutes later, scanning the room before spotting me. He looked tired. Not physically exactly, but strained, like someone who had been carrying a weight too long without putting it down. He sat without ordering anything. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. I raised a hand. "For what? For not coming to you sooner." That answer told me everything I needed to know about the nature of the conversation. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the cafe filling the space between us. Cups clinked. A barista laughed. Life continued oblivious. "I didn't want to believe it at first," Martin said finally. "I kept telling myself there was a reasonable explanation, that things were being handled informally or that you'd approved it and just hadn't mentioned it. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need details yet. I needed to understand the shape of what he was about to show me." He slid a thin folder across the table, not opening it. "There are irregularities," he said. They started small. Transfers that were technically permissible but unusual in timing and frequency. At first I flagged them as anomalies. I opened the folder slowly, scanning the first page without fully absorbing it. Then they didn't stop, he continued. They became patterns. The word landed with weight. Patterns don't happen by accident, I said. No, he agreed. They don't. He leaned back slightly, lowering his voice. There are accounts you haven't been shown. Entities registered quietly, funds moving between them in ways that obscure origin. I looked up at him then, meeting his eyes. Are you telling me my company is being siphoned? I asked. He didn't hesitate. I'm telling you, someone is preparing to operate without you. The distinction mattered. I felt something settle into place inside me, not shock, not even anger. Recognition. This was the confirmation my wife's letter had prepared me for the missing piece that turned suspicion into certainty. Martin watched me carefully, as if expecting an outburst. When none came, he seemed to relax just a fraction. They were careful, he said. Smart about it. Whoever designed this understood the optics. Nothing overt. Nothing that would trigger an audit on its own. Until you started asking questions, I said. Yes, he said quietly. Until I did. I flipped on through the pages now, taking in numbers and dates and connections that told a story without ever raising its voice. Money moving sideways. Profits redirected. A secondary structure taking shape in the shadows of the primary one. Why didn't you come to me sooner, I asked, not accusing, just curious. Martin exhaled. Because I was pressured not to, subtly, professionally. Reminded of obligations, potential conflicts, the importance of staying in my lane. And did it work? For a while, he admitted. Until it became clear that staying silent would make me complicit. That word, complicit, hung between us. You should know, he went on, this isn't about theft in the traditional sense. It's about positioning. Control. If things continued as planned, you would have found yourself irrelevant. The cafe noise seemed to recede slightly, as if my focus had narrowed to the table in front of me. They were preparing for a future without me, I said. Yes, Martin said. And they were close. I closed the folder and slid it back toward him. I don't want copies of this yet, I said. I want you to preserve everything exactly as it is. Make duplicates. Secure them. Don't alert anyone. He nodded immediately. I already have. That didn't surprise me. Martin was cautious by nature. That caution had kept him alive professionally for decades. Is there anything else? I asked. He hesitated. There's one more thing. It's not definitive, but it concerns me. I waited. There have been conversations, he said slowly. Not in writing. About your capacity. About what might happen if you were no longer able to manage your affairs independently. The words were clinical, but the implication was anything but. I felt a chill move through me, sharp and immediate. They're laying groundwork, I said. Yes. For what? For removing you without removing themselves. The clarity of it took my breath for a moment. Not because I hadn't suspected it, but because hearing it confirmed by someone outside my own head made it impossible to minimize. I thought of the doctor's appointment I hadn't scheduled. The mail that had gone missing. The gentle suggestions that I rest, that I let others handle things. Concern. Care. Protection. Disguises. Martin leaned forward. You need to understand something, Elias. Once this kind of process begins, it accelerates, and it's very difficult to reverse. I met his gaze. How much time do I have? He didn't answer immediately. Enough, he said finally. But not as much as you should. I nodded, absorbing that. We sat there a moment longer, neither of us speaking. Then I stood. Thank you, I said. For trusting me, he asked. For doing your job, I said. And for knowing when your job included speaking. He managed a small, tired smile. Outside, the air felt heavier charged. The city moved around me as it always had, unaware that something fundamental had shifted beneath its surface. I walked without destination for a while, letting the information settle. There was no room now for doubt or delay. This was no longer about family conflict or hurt feelings. This was about survival. Back in the hotel room, I laid the folder on the desk and looked at it without opening it again. The evidence existed. That was enough for now. I sat down and closed my eyes, letting myself feel the full weight of what I had learned. Not fear, not panic. Urgency. They hadn't just wanted me gone. They had wanted me neutralized, managed, rendered harmless in the most polite way possible. That realization stripped away the last traces of hesitation. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts, stopping at another name, this one marked by years of shared history and mutual respect. I didn't call yet. Not today. Today was for preparation. I stood and went to the window, looking out at the city with a clarity that bordered on cold. The pieces were in place now. The pattern was visible from every angle. This was no misunderstanding. It was a plan. And now that I could see it clearly, there was only one thing left to decide. I would not confront it. I would end it. Quietly, decisively, and on my own terms. I returned to the hotel room with a different awareness settling into my bones. The kind that sharpens your senses and makes every detail feel newly relevant. The folder Martin had shown me was no longer in my hands, but its contents followed me like a shadow. I set my keys on the desk, straightened the chair, and arranged the room the way I liked it. Order had always helped me think. Chaos invited mistakes. What Martin revealed wasn't just about money. Money was easy. Money could be tracked, corrected, reclaimed. What unsettled me was the direction of it all, the way the pieces fit together into something colder and more personal. They weren't preparing for my retirement. They were preparing for my removal. I sat down and closed my eyes, letting recent conversations replay with new clarity. Words that had once sounded considerate now carried a different weight. You've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe you should let us handle this for now. We just want what's best for you. Concern is a powerful disguise. It borrows the language of care while quietly stripping away choice. I thought of the appointment that had appeared on my calendar without my input. The mail that had been redirected for convenience. The suggestion made lightly and with a smile that I consider granting temporary authority in case anything happened. At the time, I had laughed. I had trusted. I had believed that no one who shared my blood would ever confuse control with love. That belief dissolved completely now. I picked up the phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't contacted in months. Daniel Foster, my lawyer. He'd been with me almost as long as Martin, a man who preferred precision over reassurance and never softened bad news. I dialed. Elias, he said after the first ring. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. That alone told me more than I wanted to know. We need to talk, I said. Privately, I thought so, he replied. Can you come by? Yes, I said, today. His office was quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that came from people knowing better than to interrupt certain conversations. Daniel closed the door himself and gestured for me to sit. You look steady, he said. That's good. I don't feel steady, I replied. I feel alert. That's better. I told him everything, not emotionally, chronologically. The public confrontation, the letter from my wife, Martin's findings, the conversations that now looked like rehearsals instead of coincidences. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression neutral but intent. When I finished, he leaned back and folded his hands. You're right to be concerned, he said. What you're describing fits a very familiar pattern. I waited. There are legal mechanisms, he continued, designed to protect vulnerable individuals. On paper, they're benevolent. In practice, they can be weaponized. Against me, I said. Yes. He didn't hesitate. That honesty mattered. If someone wanted to challenge your capacity, he went on, they wouldn't need to prove malice. Only concern. A few medical opinions. A narrative of stress, confusion, dependency. I felt my jaw tighten. And if that succeeded, I asked. Authority could be transferred, he said. Temporarily at first. Temporarily has a way of becoming permanent. The word hung between us. Incapacity. It wasn't a diagnosis yet. It was a strategy. How far along do you think they are? I asked. Daniel considered. Far enough that waiting is no longer neutral. That confirmed what I already knew. He leaned forward. Have you signed anything recently that you didn't fully review? No, I said. But I was encouraged to. Good, he said. That buys us time. Time. The one resource they assumed I didn't have. As we talked, memories sharpened. A form I'd declined to sign because I wanted to read it later. A follow-up email asking if I'd reconsidered. The mild disappointment when I hadn't. They weren't frustrated. They were patient. Daniel slid a notepad toward me. There's something else you should understand, he said. Once a process like this begins, it rarely stops on its own. Even if it fails, the attempt leaves a record. So, confronting them would only accelerate it, I said. Exactly. I nodded slowly. Confrontation would confirm their narrative. An agitated old man upset about losing control lashing out. That story would serve them perfectly. What are my options? I asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. He studied me as if weighing not just my words, but my posture, my tone, the steadiness of my gaze. You can stay, he said finally. Fight it. Prepare for a long, exhausting process that will put your private life under a microscope. I waited. Or he continued, you can move first. Decisively. In a way that removes the object of control entirely. The air in the room shifted. You're talking about the company, I said. Yes. I sat back, absorbing the implications. I had considered this possibility abstractly. Hearing it spoken aloud gave it weight and shape. If the company is no longer there, Daniel went on, there's no incentive to pursue incapacity. No leverage to justify interference. You become a private individual with assets, not a target with authority. Silence stretched between us. I wouldn't be destroying anything, I said slowly. I'd be ending an illusion. Daniel nodded. Exactly. I stood a few minutes later with no documents signed and no announcements made. That was deliberate. Decisions of this magnitude deserved space. Outside, the city felt different again, less crowded, more navigable. I walked for a while, letting the conversation settle. They hadn't just crossed a line. They had erased it. Money could be stolen. Reputation could be damaged. Even trust could be broken and repaired in time. Autonomy was different. Autonomy once surrendered, rarely returned intact. By the time I reached the hotel again, my course was clear. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't accuse. I wouldn't warn them that I saw what they were doing. I would outpace them. Back in the room, I sat on the edge of the bed and removed my shoes, grounding myself in the physical act. I thought again of the message from my wife, of the line she had underlined. Silence, when chosen, can be strength. This silence would be strategic. My phone buzzed. I glanced at it. Another message from my son, longer this time. I didn't read it. Not yet. I opened the suitcase and checked the contents again. Not because anything had changed, but because it reminded me of what I could carry and what I could leave behind. I wasn't afraid anymore. Fear requires uncertainty. I had clarity now. They believed they were gently guiding me toward the exit. What they didn't realize was that I had already decided who would move first. And when I did, it wouldn't be loud. It would be final. I woke the next morning with a calm that surprised me. Not the numb calm of exhaustion, but the deliberate kind that comes after a decision has already been made. The world hadn't changed overnight. The plan had. And because of that, everything felt suddenly manageable. I dressed as I always did, choosing the same neutral colors, the same comfortable shoes. Nothing about my appearance suggested urgency or alarm. That was intentional. People relax when nothing looks different. they stop watching closely. I left the hotel and walked a few blocks before stopping for coffee, nodding politely at the barista, exchanging the kind of meaningless pleasantries that reassure strangers you are exactly who you appear to be. Inside, my mind was already moving several steps ahead. Calm, I reminded myself, was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I used. Later that morning, I returned a call from my son. I kept my voice steady, my words brief. I told him I needed a few days to think that I was staying somewhere quiet, that everything was fine. He sounded relieved. Not concerned. Relieved. That told me everything I needed to know about how final they believed the situation to be. My daughter-in-law didn't speak during the call. I could hear her in the background, once faint and indistinct. But she didn't take the phone. She didn't need to. In her mind, the matter was settled. Certainty, I had learned, often bred carelessness. I ended the call politely and set the phone down, feeling no need to check for follow-up messages. There would be time for those later, when time worked in my favor. Back in the room, I laid out documents on the desk, not all at once, but methodically. Ownership records, old agreements, things I hadn't needed to look at in years because I'd trusted the people around me to respect what they represented. Trust had expired. Authority had not. I made a few calls, each one chosen carefully. Not to anyone emotionally connected to the situation, not to anyone who might feel compelled to intervene. These were professional contacts, people who understood structure, discretion, and boundaries. Each call was brief, factual. No stories, no explanations beyond what was necessary. I didn't say why. I didn't need to. People like that didn't ask questions when the request made sense on its own. One response came faster than I expected. "We can talk this afternoon," the message read. I didn't smile. I noted it. Speed was information. The rest of the day unfolded quietly. I took a walk, ate a late lunch, read the news without absorbing much of it. I made myself look unoccupied. In the late afternoon, my daughter-in-law texted. "Have you decided when you're coming back to talk?" There it was. The assumption that I would return to the scene of the verdict to discuss terms I hadn't agreed to. I waited 10 minutes before replying. "I need time. I'll reach out when I'm ready." No apology, no reassurance, no argument. A pause followed. Longer this time. Then understood. "We just want to make sure you're okay." Concern again. Always concern. I set the phone aside and turned my attention back to the desk. I reviewed timelines not because I doubted them, but because repetition brought clarity. I confirmed what I already knew. Nothing they had done had altered my legal position. They had been counting on something else to do that work for them. I made one more call as the light outside began to fade. This one mattered. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. We agreed on next steps and ended the conversation without ceremony. When I hung up, I sat still for a long moment, feeling the weight of the decision settle fully into my body. Not fear. Not excitement. Finality. There would be no undoing what came next. Relationships would change permanently. Some would end. That was inevitable. What mattered was that I would be the one choosing the moment. That evening, I went out again, this time without my phone. I walked through a nearby park watching families gather for early dinners. Children running ahead, parents calling after them with affectionate warnings. I felt a brief ache, sharp but clean. The kind that passes when you don't fight it. I sat on a bench and watched the sky darken, the first stars barely visible through the city's haze. For years I had let the future arrive without my input, assuming that adaptation was the same thing as wisdom. It wasn't. Wisdom, I realized, was knowing when to stop adapting and start deciding. When I returned to the hotel, my phone showed several missed messages. I didn't open them. There was no need. Their urgency would only grow from here. Inside the room, everything looked the same as it had that morning. Bed neatly made, suitcase closed, papers aligned. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, the door had already closed. I sat at the desk and wrote down one final note for myself. Not instructions, not reminders. A boundary. Once crossed, do not look back. I folded the paper and placed it in the notebook, then slid the notebook into the suitcase. Tomorrow would begin the countdown. The part where things moved too fast for reconsideration. Tonight, there was only stillness. They believed the situation was resolved, that I was processing that time would soften whatever resistance remained. They were wrong. Nothing had happened yet, but everything was already in motion. The countdown began without ceremony. No alarms, no dramatic moment, just a quiet acknowledgement when I looked at the time and understood that the window had opened and would not stay open for long. 48 hours. I didn't mark it on paper. I didn't need to. The number settled into my awareness like a steady pulse, measured and relentless. This was no longer about deciding what to be. That part was finished. This was about execution. The first 12 hours were procedural, almost boring if you didn't know what they meant. I reviewed confirmations, rechecked authority, verified signatures that already existed. Ownership is a simple thing when it is clear. It doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It just stands where it always has. I made calls to people who respected facts more than narratives. Each conversation was brief, efficient, and oddly calming. There was comfort in speaking with professionals who didn't ask how I felt, only what I needed. Outside the room, life moved on. I watched it through the window as if from a slight remove. Traffic thickened and thinned. Clouds crossed the sky. Somewhere, someone laughed loudly enough to cut through the glass. I didn't envy them. I didn't resent them. Their lives were not intersecting with mine in any meaningful way, and that was a relief. Mid-morning, my phone buzzed. A message from my son. "Can we talk today?" I read it once and set the phone face down. The timing told me everything. They sensed movement, even if they couldn't see it yet. Silence has a way of making people imagine worst-case scenarios, and imagination rarely calms anyone. By noon, the first irreversible step was taken. A document finalized. A confirmation received. I paused afterward not to celebrate, but to breathe. This was the point of no return. The decision itself had felt small in the moment, almost anticlimactic. A signature, a click, a quiet acknowledgement from the other end of the line. It amazed me how often life-altering events arrived without fanfare. I thought of the front door closing behind me days earlier. How ordinary that sound had been. How final. The second 12 hours brought pressure subtle at first. Messages shifted in tone, less assumption, more concern. Concern edged with confusion. "Are you okay?" "We're worried. Let us know you're safe." Safe. The word tasted strange now. I didn't reply. Silence, once chosen, becomes its own language. It said what I needed it to say without exposing me to interpretation. As afternoon slid toward evening, doubt tried once quietly to take a seat beside me. Not about the plan itself, but about the aftermath. The permanence. The knowledge that there would be no going back to the way things had been, even if I wanted to. I let the doubt speak. I listened without engaging. Then I remembered the letter, the patterns, the documents, the casual way my autonomy had been discussed as a logistical inconvenience. Doubt didn't survive that comparison. Night fell, and with it came the most dangerous hours. Fatigue loosens resolve. Darkness invites second-guessing. I made myself a simple meal and ate slowly, deliberately, as if reminding my body that routine still mattered. Afterward, I sat at the desk and reviewed the timeline again. Not because I expected surprises, but because repetition reinforced certainty. The plan didn't depend on emotion. That was its strength. Near midnight, my phone rang. Not a message this time, a call. I watched it until it stopped, then placed the phone in a drawer. I slept in short stretches, waking easily, my mind alert, but not racing. Each time I checked the clock, the number of hours remaining felt manageable. Shrinking, yes. Threatening, no. Morning arrived with a thin gray light that softened the edges of everything. I showered, dressed, and packed the suitcase with care, though I wasn't leaving yet. Preparation is its own form of reassurance. The final 12 hours were eerily quiet. No calls, no messages, no interruptions. They were waiting. I recognized the tactic. When pressure fails, stillness becomes the next move. Let the target fill the silence with their own anxiety. Let them reach out. I didn't. Instead, I waited. Waiting is not passive when the work is already done. Waiting is simply allowing cause to meet effect on its own schedule. Late in the morning, the final confirmation arrived. A brief message, professional, definitive. Everything was in place. I stood by the window and watched a delivery truck double park below the driver, hopping out with practiced impatience. Small delays, minor inconveniences, the ordinary frictions of a day that didn't know what it was carrying. Somewhere across town, people were about to learn that the ground beneath them had shifted. They still believed they were in control. That assumption had been carrying them for a long time. It had allowed them to speak loudly, to stage scenes, to place suitcases at my feet and call it resolution. Control, I had learned, rarely announces its departure. It simply stops answering when called. As the clock edged closer to the end of the 48 hours, I felt no rush, no urge to check messages or seek reassurance. The work had moved beyond me now. Systems were doing what systems do when properly set in motion. I sat down and folded my hands, the quiet settling around me like a held breath. In a matter of hours, they would understand, not because I explained, not because I warned, but because reality would introduce itself calmly and without apology. The morning everything became official began like any other. No thunder, no sense of drama. Just the quiet certainty that comes when a decision has already passed through doubt and come out intact on the other side. I woke early, dressed carefully, and checked the time once, not because I was anxious, but because timing mattered. Precision had replaced emotion entirely now. This wasn't a gamble. It was a conclusion. Outside, the city moved with its usual indifference. Cars idled at intersections. Someone argued into a phone on the sidewalk. Somewhere a coffee machine hissed and sputtered. None of it paused for me, and that felt appropriate. The building where I was headed wasn't impressive. No glass tower, no dramatic lobby. Just a clean, quiet place where decisions were documented instead of debated. That alone told me I was in the right room. Inside, people greeted me with professional neutrality. Not warmth, not suspicion, recognition. They knew who I was because the document said so. Authority didn't require introduction here. I sat at a long table, my hands folded, listening as details were confirmed. Numbers, dates, procedures, each one familiar, each one final. Ownership was verified again, though it didn't need to be. Sole authority. No encumbrances, no shared control. Everything exactly as it had always been, despite how confidently others had spoken, as if it were otherwise. I felt something like relief then, not because I doubted the truth, but because hearing it stated plainly stripped away the last remnants of uncertainty. Assumptions collapse quickly when they're placed next to facts. Papers were laid out in front of me, aligned, neatly tabs placed with care. I read them slowly, line by line. Not out of hesitation, but respect. This company had taken decades to build. It deserved a careful ending. My signature waited at the bottom of the final page. I picked up the pen and paused, not for sentiment, but for acknowledgement. This was the moment where past and future separated cleanly, where everything that came after would be shaped by this single act. I signed. The pen moved smoothly across the paper. No shaking, no flourish. Just a name written the same way I'd written it 1,000 times before, now carrying a different weight. When I set the pen down, no one clapped. No one spoke. A quiet confirmation was given. A document was collected. A process advanced. The transfer began. Numbers changed hands invisibly, moving through systems designed to make large shifts feel ordinary. Somewhere accounts updated, ledgers balanced, authority reassigned. I exhaled slowly, feeling something lift from my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Control had changed hands permanently, and it had happened without confrontation, without accusation, without noise. This was not revenge. Revenge seeks witnesses. This was closure. I stood and thanked the people in the room, not out of courtesy alone, but because gratitude felt appropriate. They had done their jobs well. They had respected boundaries. They had treated me as a person making a rational decision, not a problem to be managed. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter, as if the city had shifted its posture slightly to accommodate the change. Nothing looked different, but I felt different walking through it. I checked my phone once out of curiosity rather than concern. No messages yet. That would change soon. The truth always arrives faster than explanations. I walked for a while, letting the movement burn off the last traces of tension. The company was gone now, not lost, not stolen, but released. What remained was mine again: time, clarity, autonomy. People often misunderstand what it means to sell something you built. They imagine it as surrender or loss or failure to hold on. They don't understand the relief of letting go when holding on has become a weapon in someone else's hands. I stopped at a cafe and ordered lunch, sitting near the window. I ate slowly, tasting the food instead of rushing through it. This too felt new. Halfway through the meal, my phone vibrated. I didn't look at it. I already knew. The consequences had begun moving before I left the building. Systems talk to each other. News travels quietly until it doesn't. I finished eating, paid, and left, choosing not to read the messages yet. There was no urgency on my side anymore. That privilege had shifted as well. Back in the hotel room, I packed carefully, folding clothes, placing items deliberately. The suitcase felt lighter than it had days earlier, not because it contained less, but because it carried no uncertainty. I sat on the bed and allowed myself one honest thought. They will feel this before they understand it. That wasn't cruelty. It was reality. When you build your power on assumptions, the collapse comes without warning. My phone vibrated again, this time insistently. I glanced at the screen. My daughter-in-law's name. I turned the phone face down. I wasn't avoiding her. I was choosing the order of things. There would be time for conversations later, when the facts were no longer negotiable. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the building. Somewhere a door closed. Somewhere else someone laughed. I thought about the house I'd walked out of. The certainty with which my worth had been declared obsolete. The way a single suitcase had been offered as a summary of my life. That chapter was closed now. Not slammed. Closed properly. I picked up the phone once more and powered it off. I didn't need to announce what I had done. I didn't need to explain my reasoning or defend my choice. The system would do that for me. Reality, once introduced, rarely requires commentary. I stood, picked up the suitcase, and set it by the door. Everything was ready now. Not just the logistics. Me. The man who had signed those papers was not acting out of anger or fear. He was acting out of clarity earned at a high cost. As I turned off the lights and prepared to leave, one final thought settled in with quiet certainty. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply taken myself back. And sometimes, that is the most disruptive act of all. The phone began ringing before I'd finished packing, the vibrations sharp and insistent against the quiet of the room. I looked at the screen, once recognized the number, and let it ring. It rang again. I sat on the edge of the bed, tying my shoes slowly, deliberately. There was no rush anymore. Whatever urgency existed belonged to someone else now. When the ringing stopped, a message followed almost immediately. "Elias, please call me. There's been a mistake." The word mistake caught my attention, not because it surprised me, but because of how quickly it had replaced certainty. Less than 48 hours earlier, there had been no room for error in her voice. Now it was the only explanation she could reach for. I finished tying my shoes and stood smoothing my jacket as if I were about to leave the room. In a way, I already had. The phone buzzed again. This time, a voicemail. I listened without sitting down. Her voice sounded different. Not loud, not sharp. Controlled but strained, like someone trying to hold water in cupped hands. "We don't understand what's happening," she said. "Accounts are frozen. People are calling. We need to talk. We need..." The phrase landed where it always had, heavy with assumption. I set the phone down and zipped the suitcase. For years I had been responding to that tone, adjusting, making room, filling gaps. It was strange how quickly the habit fell away once I stopped feeding it. Another call came through, this one from my son. I hesitated, then answered. "Dad," he said, breathless. "What did you do?" I closed my eyes briefly, not from regret, but from the weight of how predictable the question was. "I made a decision," I said. "About the company," his voice cracked. "Why didn't you talk to us first?" I leaned against the desk, grounding myself. "You didn't talk to me first when you decided I no longer belonged in your home." There was silence on the line. Not the defiant kind. The stunned kind. "That was different," he said finally. "No," I replied quietly. "It wasn't." He started to say something else, then stopped. I could hear someone in the background whispering urgently. "Her. Can she talk to you?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't punishing them. I was measuring my own capacity. When I spoke again, my voice was steady. "Put her on." The line shifted, a brief rustle, and then her voice filled the space between us. "Elias," she said too carefully. "We need to fix this. Fix." Another word chosen for its softness. "I don't think we do," I said. She took a breath, then launched into an explanation that moved quickly, as if speed could replace substance. There were misunderstandings. Advisors had acted independently. Things had gotten out of hand. I listened without interrupting. As she spoke, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt distance. Emotional and physical, like watching a storm move across water you're no longer sailing. When she paused, waiting for reassurance or resistance, I spoke. "You removed me from my own life without asking," I said. "You decided what I was worth and announced it in front of strangers. Everything that's happening now follows from that moment." Her voice shifted, then urgency giving way to something closer to fear. "We were trying to help," she said. "You were stressed. You weren't yourself." I almost smiled. "I was myself," I said. "You just didn't like who that was anymore." She tried a different approach. Family, history, the future she said she'd imagined for all of us. The way things could still be if I'd just slow down and listen. "Please," she said finally. "We can make this right." That word again, right. As if what had been done could be rewound, reset, smoothed over. I let the silence stretch between us. Silence, I'd learned, was where truth surfaced when nothing else worked. "I'm not angry," I said at last. "But I'm finished." "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means I won't be explaining myself anymore," I said. "And I won't be reversing a decision made to protect my dignity." Her breath hitched. "You sold everything, yes? You didn't think about what that would do to us?" I thought of the suitcase, the porch, the eyes of the neighbors. "I did," I said. "I just thought about myself as well." She was quiet then. Not calculating, not rehearsing. Just quiet. "Is there anything we can do?" she asked. The question wasn't strategic anymore. It was human. "No," I said gently. The word felt heavy, but clean. I heard my son's voice again in the background, low and urgent. I imagined his face, the confusion, the realization that the structure he'd relied on had been built on something he never fully understood. "I hope you figure things out," I said. "Truly." "You're just going to walk away?" she asked, disbelief creeping back in. "I already did," I replied. I ended the call before she could respond. For a moment, I stood there with the phone in my hand, listening to the sudden quiet. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I felt lighter. I powered the phone off and placed it in the suitcase, then closed it gently, as if sealing a chapter rather than a container. Outside, the hallway was empty. I rolled the suitcase toward the elevator and waited, the hum of the building filling the space around me. When the doors opened, I stepped inside alone. As the elevator descended, I thought about the man I'd been just days earlier. The one standing on a porch with a single suitcase, listening to his worth being defined by someone who had benefited from his silence. That man had been hurt, disoriented, still hoping somewhere deep down that misunderstanding was the problem. He was gone now. In the lobby, no one looked up as I passed through. That anonymity felt like a gift. Outside, the air was cool and steady. I took a deep breath and let it fill my lungs without resistance. The past didn't release its grip all at once. It loosened gradually as I walked away from the building and toward whatever came next. For the first time in years, the silence around me wasn't something imposed. It was something I had chosen. And in that choice, I felt something I hadn't expected. Freedom. The morning after the last call arrived without urgency. No buzzing phone, no unanswered messages pulling at my attention. Just light filtering through unfamiliar curtains and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. For a long moment I stayed in bed, not because I was tired, but because I was listening. Not for sounds outside, but for what was happening inside me. There was space, not emptiness. Space. The kind that appears when something heavy has finally been set down. I made coffee in the small kitchenette and drank it slowly by the window. Outside, the city moved the way it always had. People walking dogs, someone late for work, a delivery truck blocking traffic while the driver argued politely with a cyclist. Life uncomplicated by my story. I realized then how much energy I had spent for years anticipating reactions. Measuring words, predicting moods, adjusting myself to fit rooms that had grown smaller without my noticing. That effort was gone now. Later that morning, I checked out and drove toward the coast, the road opening up in front of me like an invitation rather than an escape. I had chosen this place deliberately, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was quiet in a way that didn't feel lonely. The ocean has a way of reminding you how small and how free you are at the same time. I rented a modest place overlooking the water. Nothing extravagant, nothing symbolic, just enough. I unpacked slowly, placing items where they made sense, not where they looked impressive. The suitcase emptied quickly. It turned out I needed very little to feel grounded. In the afternoons, I walked along the shoreline, letting the sound of the waves replace the noise that had lived in my head for so long. I watched families pass by, couples arguing softly, children racing ahead and then circling back. I didn't feel envy. I felt understanding. Everyone is carrying something. The difference is whether you let it define you or teach you. I thought about the money eventually. The 8 million everyone seemed so sure belonged to them. I hadn't rushed that decision either. Wealth. I had learned reveals character long before it changes circumstance. I set aside a portion for medical research connected to the illness that took my wife. Quiet donations, no plaques, no announcements, just gratitude returned to the world in the only way that felt honest. The rest became what it always should have been. Security, choice, time. I didn't buy anything large. I didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. The absence of that urge felt like its own kind of luxury. Sometimes in the evenings, I thought about my son, about the look on his face I imagined when the truth finally settled in, stripped of explanations and justifications. I hoped he would learn something from it. Not about money or authority, but about what happens when you mistake silence for weakness and patience for permission. I didn't reach out. Not because I was bitter, but because distance is sometimes the only boundary that actually holds. Letting go, I discovered, isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive with speeches or final gestures. It happens quietly, one ordinary day at a time, until you realize the past no longer has a grip on your present. One evening, as the sun dropped low and turned the water copper and gold, I sat on a bench and thought about the word that had started everything. Worthless. It was a word thrown easily carelessly by someone who needed it to be true. Not because it described me, but because it justified what she wanted. I understood that now. Worth is not something other people assign. It isn't measured by usefulness to them or by how convenient you make their lives. Worth is intrinsic. It doesn't expire with age. It doesn't diminish because someone else grows impatient. And it cannot be taken unless you hand it over yourself. I hadn't handed mine over. That realization brought a peace deeper than satisfaction, deeper even than relief. I was not rescued. I had rescued myself. In the weeks that followed, my days settled into a rhythm that felt natural rather than imposed. Morning walks, afternoon reading, conversations with strangers who knew nothing about my past and expected nothing from me beyond courtesy. Occasionally, someone would ask what I used to do. I built something, once I'd say. That was enough. Because what mattered wasn't what I had built, but what I had reclaimed. My dignity, my autonomy, my right to decide what came next. If there is one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Being underestimated is not the tragedy people think it is. It's an opportunity, one that requires patience, clarity, and the courage to act without applause. If you've ever been told you were too old, too slow, too much of a burden, or simply in the way, I hope you hear this clearly. You are not done. You are not invisible. And your value does not depend on anyone else's approval. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated or pushed aside when you least deserved it? Share your experience in the comments. These conversations matter more than you think. And if you want to stay with this channel for more stories about dignity, quiet strength, and justice that doesn't need to shout, consider subscribing. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us who we already are. Thank you for listening.